What does a civilization choose to remember, and what does it quietly let disappear? History often reaches us in fragments: a broken blade in the dirt, a name carried by a tired chronicler, a line in a manuscript copied centuries after the people themselves were gone. We imagine the past as a long, steady march from the primitive to the refined, from chaos to order. But every so often, the record resists that comforting story. It offers us something stranger: moments when human beings seem to discover a form of discipline, invention, or collective power far ahead of what their age should have allowed. Across deserts, mountains, islands, and imperial capitals, there once appeared military forces so unusual that they still feel almost unreal. Some were bound by love, some by ritual, some by absolute loyalty to a throne, or by training so severe it reshaped a person's entire identity. They emerged in worlds ruled by kings, city-states, and fragile empires, yet they moved with a precision that feels startlingly modern. Then, just as suddenly, they were gone, not forgotten entirely. Never that, but dimmed, their methods scattered, their stories absorbed into legend, propaganda, or silence. What survives is rarely complete. We inherit the outline of something formidable, and we are left to imagine the rest. This is not a story about invincibility. Every force in this journey was human, and therefore mortal. They bled, feared, adapted, and vanished like all things made by human hands. What makes them unforgettable is something deeper than victory. It is the unsettling thought that the past may have been more inventive, more psychologically complex, and more emotionally charged than we are used to admitting. So we begin with a question that hangs over every battlefield and every archive alike. When extraordinary knowledge disappears, is it truly lost, or does it remain somewhere beneath the surface, waiting for history to remember what people once dared to become? What if the strongest force on a battlefield was not built on fear, but on love? In the 4th century BCE, in the city of Thebes, a military experiment took shape that still feels startling, even now. Greece was a world of rival city-states, proud traditions, and hardened men trained to stand shoulder to shoulder in the crush of battle. Strength was measured in rank, inheritance, and endurance. But Thebes imagined something different. It built an elite core not around bloodline or wealth, but around devotion between partners. They were known as the Sacred Band, 300 chosen warriors arranged in pairs, each man bound to another by affection, loyalty, and shared honor. To modern ears, that may sound intimate in a private sense. In their time, it was also profoundly strategic. The belief was simple and deeply human. A person would fight with unmatched courage when standing beside someone whose life mattered as much as his own. This was not poetry masquerading as military theory. It worked. The Sacred Band trained continuously, not as a temporary levy, but as a disciplined, year-round force. They moved with a unity that unsettled their enemies. When Thebes challenged Sparta at Leuctra in 371 BCE, the old balance of Greece cracked open. Sparta, long considered nearly unbeatable on land, met a formation that did not behave as expected. Theban command bent the rules of war, concentrated force where tradition said it should not be, and at the heart of that design stood the Sacred Band. The Spartan line collapsed, an empire of reputation fell in a single day. And yet what lingers is not only their victory, it is the idea beneath it. These men suggest that human attachment, often dismissed as weakness in war, can become a source of terrifying resolve. Their courage was not abstract. It had a face, a voice, a familiar hand on a shield rim. When Macedon rose, the Sacred Band met its end at Chaeronea, fighting to the last rather than retreat. Their story survives in fragments, in graves, in the astonishment of later generations. But maybe that is enough, because their question remains alive. What kinds of strength have we ignored simply because they do not fit the usual story of power? How do you create a soldier who no longer belongs to himself? Far from the marble cities of Greece, another answer to military power emerged in the heart of the Ottoman world. It did not begin with inherited nobility or tribal loyalty. It began with separation. Boys were taken from Christian families in the Balkans, converted, educated, drilled, and folded into the machinery of empire. Out of that painful system came one of history's most disciplined fighting forces, the Janissaries. Their origins still carry a moral unease that no admiration for their skill can erase. They were built through coercion, through the uprooting of childhood itself. Yet history is often made from such contradictions. The empire did not simply want warriors. It wanted instruments of absolute allegiance, men cut free from old bonds and remade in service to the Sultan. In that transformation, the Janissaries became more than soldiers. They became a new kind of state power. At first, their discipline was almost monastic. They lived under strict rules, trained relentlessly, and were expected to embody restraint as much as ferocity. On the battlefield, they were calm where others were chaotic. They mastered firearms early, adapted faster than many European rivals, and helped turn the Ottoman military into one of the most formidable forces of its age. When the walls of Constantinople finally gave way in 1453, the Janissaries stood at the center of a world-changing victory. An old empire ended, another announced itself with cannon smoke and marching feet. But the same structure that made them powerful also planted the seeds of decay. Over time, privilege softened discipline. Positions became hereditary. Political influence grew. The core that had once represented order began to resist reform, protecting status rather than excellence. What had been forged as a weapon of renewal slowly hardened into an obstacle against change. In 1826, the Ottoman state destroyed the institution it had once depended on. The event was brutal, deliberate, and final. Barracks burned. Survivors were hunted. A centuries-old military identity vanished almost overnight. The Janissaries leave behind a troubling lesson. Human beings can be shaped into extraordinary systems of loyalty and control, but no structure stays pure forever. The question is not only how power is built, it is when that power stops serving the future and begins defending its own shadow. What happens when war becomes a way of life so complete that childhood itself disappears inside it? In ancient Sparta, the making of a soldier did not begin with enlistment. It began almost at birth. The city's reputation has traveled across centuries in hard outlines. Discipline, endurance, silence, obedience. But behind that image was something more unsettling. Sparta did not simply train men for battle. It organized an entire society around the expectation that every citizen male would become a weapon in defense of the state. The process was called the agog, and it was as much a test of identity as of strength. Boys were removed from their families while still young and placed into a system designed to harden body and mind together. Hunger was used as a lesson. Pain was treated as instruction. Competition was constant, but so was mutual dependence. They learned to move in formation, to speak little, to fear shame more than death. In time, the Spartan warrior became less an individual than a living part of a civic machine. To outside observers, this looked almost superhuman. On the battlefield, Spartans were admired and feared for their discipline, especially in an age when many armies were still citizen militias called up in moments of crisis. Their phalanx held with a steadiness that seemed to erase panic itself. At Thermopylae, later memory turned their sacrifice into legend, not because they were the only brave men there, but because they had already come to symbolize an ideal of refusal. To yield was unthinkable. To stand was identity. And yet even the most intimidating system carries a cost. Sparta's military excellence depended on a narrow ruling class sustained by the labor of others, especially the helots whose unfreedom made Spartan citizenship possible. Fear of revolt shaped the state as so much as courage did. The society that looked so stable from the outside was in many ways permanently on edge, guarding itself not just from foreign enemies, but from a violence buried in its own foundation. Over time, numbers dwindled. Wealth disparities widened. The citizen body shrank. The myth endured longer than the structure that produced it. That may be the most revealing part of Sparta's story. It reminds us that a culture can become unforgettable for its strength while hiding the fragility beneath it. And it asks a harder question still. When a society worships toughness above all else, what parts of the human spirit does it quietly train itself to lose? Can an army be built not from a nation, but from a tide of riders moving faster than memory can follow? Across the Eurasian steppe, where the land seems to stretch beyond the patience of maps, the Mongols learned to live inside motion. Their world was open grass, long horizons, harsh winters, and distances that would exhaust settled empires before a campaign had even begun. Out of that landscape came a military force so adaptive, so disciplined, and so psychologically astute that it transformed nearly everything it touched. To those who faced them, they did not seem to arrive in the usual way. They appeared like weather. The brilliance of the Mongol War Machine was not simply speed, though speed was everywhere in it. It was organization. Riders were arranged in decimal units from tens to thousands, allowing command to move clearly across enormous spaces. Each soldier traveled with multiple horses, changing mounts to preserve momentum. Communication moved through signal flags, horns, couriers, and rehearsed coordination. What looked like chaos from a distance was often precise design. Retreat could be a trap, silence could be a threat, panic in the enemy camp was itself a weapon. Under leaders like Genghis Khan and his successors, the Mongols absorbed techniques from every world they encountered. They used engineers, siege specialists, translators, and local administrators. They did not worship one fixed style of war. They studied vulnerability and adapted. A walled city could not rely on walls alone. A larger army could not trust its size. Again and again, established powers discovered that tradition was a poor defense against an enemy willing to learn faster than anyone expected. And yet the terror they inspired has often flattened them in memory, turning a complex imperial system into a single image of fire and hooves. The destruction was real. So was the innovation. Roads, trade routes, diplomacy, and exchange also moved in the wake of conquest. The Mongol army was not only an engine of ruin, it was a force that revealed how connected distant worlds already were, even through violence. In time, the empire fractured, successor states settled, momentum became administration. The storm became history, but their legacy still unsettles us. They showed that power can belong to those who remain flexible, while others cling to certainty. And they leave behind a question the modern world still struggles to answer. When a force moves faster than our imagination, do we mistake its intelligence for chaos simply because we cannot keep up? What kind of army can survive not by conquering the land, but by mastering the sea between worlds? On the cold edge of northern Europe, where mist hangs low over dark water and the shoreline breaks into islands, the Vikings learned a different grammar of power. Their strength did not come from massive standing armies or the fixed grandeur of an empire's capital. It came from movement, timing, and the uncanny intimacy they had with rivers, tides, and coastlines. Their ships were not just vessels. They were the reason distant monasteries, towns, and kingdoms suddenly felt vulnerable. The longship changed everything. Narrow, flexible, and astonishingly swift, it could cross open water and slip into shallow rivers that larger ships could never enter. That meant nowhere near the coast was truly secure. An attack could begin with silence at dawn, oars moving through gray light, and end in smoke before a local lord even understood what had happened. To those on shore, the Vikings seemed to come from the horizon itself, as if the sea had chosen a shape and stepped onto land. But rate alone does not explain their endurance. Viking forces were not simply bands of reckless fighters driven by hunger for gold. They were highly capable navigators, traders, settlers, and political opportunists. They understood terrain, seasonal rhythm, and the fractured nature of the societies they encountered. In England, Francia, Ireland, and beyond, they exploited weak borders and divided rulers. Sometimes they plundered, sometimes they negotiated, sometimes they stayed, married, farmed, and became part of the very landscapes they had once terrified. That is what makes them so difficult to hold in one image. They were feared for violence, but they were also agents of exchange, carrying stories, crafts, beliefs, and ambitions across a wide maritime world. Their weapons mattered, yet so did their adaptability. The same people who burned a monastery could later build a market town. The same ship that brought warriors could carry families, livestock, and the idea of another future. Eventually, kingdoms centralized. Defenses improved. Christianity spread more deeply through the north. The Viking Age did not end in a single battle, but through transformation. Raiders became rulers, outsiders became ancestors, and maybe that is their lasting mystery. They remind us that some of history's most feared forces do not disappear by being defeated. They disappear by changing shape so completely that later generations forget where the story truly began. What does loyalty look like when it is dressed in silk armored in ritual, and asked to stand between an emperor and the collapse of a world. In the Byzantine Empire, power did not only live on the battlefield, it lived in ceremony, in corridors of polished stone, in candlelight reflecting off gold mosaics, in the careful choreography of rank. And at the center of that world stood the Varangian Guard, an elite force whose reputation grew not from local roots, but from foreign distance. They were outsiders by design, warriors brought from the cold north and, later from the Anglo-Saxon world, trusted precisely because they had fewer ties to the intrigues of Constantinople. Their presence must have felt almost mythic. Towering men with heavy axes, speaking unfamiliar languages, standing silent in palace halls while factions whispered around them. In a court famous for conspiracy, betrayal, and delicate political games, the Varangians offered something rare: visible physical certainty. Their duty was personal. They protected the emperor not as an abstraction, but as a living center of the state. In a fragile empire, that closeness made them both feared and revered. Yet they were more than ceremonial giants. On campaign, the Varangian Guard earned a reputation for stubborn force, especially in moments when battles narrowed into brutal, close-range struggle. Their style was direct, disciplined, and psychologically potent. They did not merely defend a ruler's body, they embodied the empire's claim that order could still be maintained, even when enemies pressed in from every direction. There is something deeply revealing in the fact that Byzantium relied so often on foreigners for its most intimate protection. Trust, in this case, was built not from sameness, but from separation. The court understood a painful truth: people closest to power are often the most dangerous to it. The farther a guard stood from the ambitions of local elites, the more dependable he might become. Over time, the empire changed, contracted, and endured beyond what many thought possible. But no guard, however legendary, can hold back history forever. As Byzantine strength waned, so too did the distinct world that had made the Varangians necessary. What remains is an image as striking as any in military history: men from distant shores defending a civilization that was not originally their own, yet became part of their identity. And it leaves us with a question that feels larger than empire itself. Is loyalty strongest when it grows from belonging, or when it is chosen in a place far from home? Can fear itself be organized, trained, and marched into battle until an army becomes larger in memory than it ever was in life? In the ancient Near East, the Assyrians understood something that many early empires only learned slowly. Conquest was not just a matter of strength, it was a matter of theater. Their armies did not merely defeat enemies, they made examples of them. Relief carvings on palace walls, royal inscriptions, and the carefully cultivated image of unstoppable violence worked together to send a message far beyond the battlefield. Resist, and the consequences will echo. This was not empty boasting. The Assyrians built one of the most sophisticated military systems of the ancient world. They maintained standing forces when many rivals still depended on temporary levies. They used specialized troops, siege engines, cavalry, archers, engineers, and logistics on a scale that made sustained expansion possible. Cities that once trusted their walls began to learn that walls alone were no longer enough. The empire did not advance as a loose wave of raiders. It moved like a machine learning how to perfect itself. Their genius was partly technical and partly psychological. Siege warfare became a science of pressure. Ramps were built, tunnels were dug, towers rolled forward. Defenders who hoped time would save them often found that time now belonged to the attacker. And when a city finally fell, the memory of what followed was often shaped deliberately to terrify the next cities into surrendering before the first stone had even been struck. Yet there is something haunting in how modern people remember Assyria. Its cruelty is vivid, sometimes more vivid than its administrative brilliance, engineering, or cultural complexity. That imbalance is understandable, but it also reveals how power chooses its afterlife. The empire crafted an image of itself as relentless, and history obeyed. Even now, the emotional residue remains, but terror is difficult to sustain forever. Empires built on pressure must keep pressing. Enemies adapt, provinces strain, succession weakens, coalitions form. In time, the Assyrian state that had seemed almost beyond challenge fractured with startling speed. Great cities fell. The machine stopped. And so their story lingers as both warning and mirror. They prove that fear can extend the reach of power, but also that fear leaves a brittle inheritance. When force becomes a civilization's loudest language, what survives after its fall? The achievements it built, or the echo of the dread it taught the world to remember? What if the most disciplined army in Europe was forged not by wealth or empire, but by a people defending mountains that taught them patience? In the high valleys of Switzerland, where the air thins and the land rises in stern silence, a remarkable kind of infantry emerged during the late Middle Ages. These were not soldiers wrapped in the splendor of ancient courts or backed by a vast imperial machine. They came from small communities shaped by steep ground, local obligations, and the hard habits of rural life. Yet on the battlefields of Europe, the Swiss pikemen became one of the most feared military forces of their age. Their strength came from collective discipline. Armed with long pikes and trained to move as a dense, coordinated mass, they turned infantry into a force capable of breaking the dominance of heavily armored knights. For centuries, mounted nobility had embodied military prestige. The charge of cavalry was not only a tactical act, it was a social statement, a performance of rank and inherited power. The Swiss disrupted that order. When their formations held firm and advanced together, they showed that cohesion could defeat grandeur. There was something almost architectural about the way they fought. A forest of spear points moved across the field with grim intention, difficult to penetrate and dangerous to approach. Their formations demanded trust. Every man depended on the steadiness of the line, on the timing of feet, on the refusal of panic. One weak point could become disaster. But when the structure held, it transformed ordinary men into something larger than themselves. European rulers noticed. Soon Swiss mercenaries were in demand far beyond their homeland, hired by kings and princes who wanted a share of that mountain-forged precision. Their fame spread across Italy, France, and the Holy Roman Empire. Yet success carried its own risks. Once military excellence becomes a commodity, identity begins to shift. The defenders of a homeland can become professionals in foreign causes, their reputation traveling even where their original purpose does not. Then came change. Gunpowder weapons improved. Battlefields evolved. Dense pike formations that once felt nearly unstoppable became more vulnerable in a new age of firepower and artillery. The old mastery did not vanish all at once, but its advantage narrowed until legend outlived supremacy. The Swiss pikemen leave behind a quiet but enduring truth. Power does not always begin in centers of luxury or empire. Sometimes it rises from communities that learn, through hardship, how to move together. And perhaps that is the deeper question they offer us. In moments of upheaval, is survival more often won by individual brilliance or by the rare discipline of people willing to stand as one? What does it mean when an empire's most trusted warriors no longer defend a border, but become the border between ruler and ruin? In imperial Rome, few military names carry the same weight as the Praetorian Guard. They were not stationed on distant frontiers where mud, hunger, and long campaigns shaped ordinary legionaries. Their world was closer to the center, the capital, the palace, the breathing heart of political power. At first glance, they were elite protectors, men chosen to defend generals and later emperors with a level of prestige few soldiers could imagine. But proximity to power changes the meaning of service. It can turn guardians into gatekeepers, and gatekeepers into kingmakers. The Praetorians were the image of order. They were better paid than regular troops, more visible in public life, and wrapped in the aura of imperial necessity. In a city where rumor could spread faster than command, their presence offered reassurance that the emperor stood behind a wall of disciplined steel. Yet Rome's greatest vulnerability was often not invasion from outside, but instability from within. Succession was rarely simple. Loyalty was rarely pure. In that atmosphere, the Guard's importance deepened until it became dangerous. They were close enough to hear the tremors before anyone else, close enough to sense weakness, ambition, fear. Over time, the Praetorian Guard learned that the man they protected depended on them just as much as they depended on him. That realization altered Roman politics. Emperors were elevated, manipulated, abandoned, and in some cases murdered by the very force meant to keep them alive. At one notorious moment, the imperial throne itself was effectively auctioned to the highest bidder. as if Rome's highest office had become another piece of military property. And yet the story is not one of simple corruption. The Guard emerged from a real need. In a vast empire built on personal authority, the body of the ruler mattered. If the emperor fell, the state could convulse. The tragedy was that the mechanism designed to preserve stability became one of the most efficient tools for breaking it. Eventually, later emperors understood the danger too clearly to ignore. The Praetorian Guard was dissolved, its political role broken by rulers who had learned that protection can become a form of captivity. Their legacy feels surprisingly modern. Institutions built to defend power can slowly begin to shape it, then control it, then feed on it. The question Rome leaves us is as sharp now as it was then. When the people closest to authority gain the power to decide who may wield it, who is really being guarded in the end? What kind of army is born when extremist endurance and ambition are forced to share the same campfire? In the deserts and rising kingdoms of North Africa, the Mamluks emerged from one of history's most striking contradictions. They began as enslaved boys, purchased from distant lands, converted, trained, and transformed into elite military servants. Like the Janissaries in another age, they were cut away from their origins and remade through discipline. But the Mamluks would go further. They would not only defend a state, they would eventually become the state itself. Their training was relentless, but it was also deeply social. Horsemanship, archery, swordsmanship, and drill were only part of the process. The larger transformation was psychological. These men were bound by shared education, shared isolation, and a carefully constructed identity that placed loyalty to their core above all else. In a world where dynasties rose and broke under pressure, that bond gave them extraordinary cohesion. They were outsiders, yet they became the sharp edge of political survival. Their greatest moment came in the 13th century, when the Mongol advance seemed almost unstoppable. City after city had fallen across Asia and the Islamic world. The old assumptions of safety had collapsed. Then, at Ain Jalut in 1260, the Mamluks met that tide and turned it back. The victory was not merely tactical. It was civilizational in the way later generations understood it. For many, it felt like proof that catastrophe was not inevitable, that even the most feared force on earth could be resisted by discipline, leadership, and nerve. Yet their power did not rest only on battlefields. In Egypt and Syria, the Mamluks built a culture of rule marked by patronage, architecture, scholarship, and ceremony. They were warriors, but they were also governors of cities, protectors of trade, and curators of legitimacy. Their mosques, schools, and markets testified to something more complicated than military dominance alone. They had been made through violence, yet they became custodians of urban life. And still, the paradox never disappeared. A ruling class born from military slavery could produce brilliance, but it also carried fragility inside its design. Succession was rarely simple. Rivalries hardened. New weapons and shifting imperial realities changed the terms of power. By the time the Ottomans defeated them in the 16th century, the Mamluks remained formidable. But history had begun to move in another direction. Their story leaves behind a difficult, deeply human insight. Identity is not always inherited. Sometimes it is forged under pressure, in separation, in the strange intimacy of shared hardship. But even the strongest brotherhood cannot escape time forever. And so the Mamluks ask us a question that lingers well beyond their era. When people are remade by the systems that use them, at what point do they stop serving history and begin writing it for themselves? What if the soldiers history remembers as symbols of loyalty were also men living inside the loneliness of immortality? In ancient Persia, the Greeks gave them a name that has endured for centuries, the Immortals. The title itself feels like legend, as if no ordinary army could carry it without becoming larger than life. Yet behind the myth stood a very real elite corps serving the Achaemenid Empire, one of the greatest imperial systems of the ancient world. 10,000 strong or so. The tradition says they were called immortal because whenever one man fell, another immediately took his place. The number never appeared to diminish. To enemies, that constancy must have seemed almost supernatural. Their power was not based on brute force alone. The Persian Empire stretched across enormous distances, linking languages, climates, religions, and peoples. Governing such a realm required more than conquest. It required the visible performance of stability. The immortals were part of that performance. They marched not just as soldiers, but as living proof that the empire possessed order, continuity, and reach. Their uniforms, equipment, and disciplined appearance carried symbolic weight. They were the empire made visible in human form. On campaign, they served as both guard and striking force, close to the king, yet capable of operating in broader military actions. Their role bridged the ceremonial and the practical, much like the empire itself. Persia understood that authority had to be felt emotionally as well as enforced militarily. A ruler surrounded by chosen warriors projected inevitability. In a world of fragile loyalties and regional unrest, that image mattered almost as much as the sword. And yet the name immortal conceals a deeply human truth. No soldier escapes death. No empire escapes decline. The replacement of the fallen may preserve the appearance of permanence, but it cannot preserve the individual life that disappears beneath the banner. In that sense, the immortals were not evidence that humans can transcend time. They were evidence of how desperately political systems try to look as if they can. When Alexander's armies shattered the Persian order, the grandeur of that old imperial image began to fracture with it. The immortals, at least as a distinct and enduring symbol, passed into memory. What survived was the impression they left on others, a force defined as much by theater, continuity, and imperial imagination as by combat itself. Perhaps that is why their story still resonates. We are always tempted by symbols of permanence, by institutions that seem too polished, too orderly, too complete to fail. But the immortals remind us that continuity is often a carefully maintained illusion. The deeper question is not whether something can appear eternal. It is what that appearance asks human beings to surrender in order to keep the illusion alive. What remains after the banners are lowered, the armor rusts, and the names that once frightened continents are reduced to a few lines in a book. By the time we reach the final chapter before this story closes, the pattern has become impossible to ignore. Again and again, history gives birth to military forces that seem to concentrate the will of an age. They rise from need, fear, devotion, ambition, geography, or belief. For a time, they appear almost larger than the societies that created them. Then the world changes. Technology shifts. Politics harden. Moral confidence weakens. What once felt permanent becomes strangely fragile, and the most feared formations on Earth slip into memory. Look across the centuries and the details differ, but the rhythm feels familiar. The Sacred Band turned intimacy into courage. Sparta transformed discipline into identity. The Mongols made movement itself a weapon. The Janissaries and Mamluks revealed how institutions could remake human beings into instruments of state, only to become powers in their own right. The Vikings mastered water. The Swiss mastered cohesion. The Assyrians mastered fear. The Praetorians mastered proximity. The Varangians mastered chosen loyalty. And the immortals mastered the appearance of permanence. Each force answered a different historical problem. Each seemed for a while to have discovered a secret. But perhaps there was never a secret at all. Perhaps what we are really seeing is the endless adaptability of human beings under pressure. We create systems to protect what we love, to expand what we desire, to survive what threatens us. Some of those systems become magnificent. Some become cruel. Most become both. That is why these armies still matter. They are not only stories of war, they are mirrors held up to the societies that imagined them. And that may be the most haunting truth of all. No elite force endures because no civilization remains exactly what it was when that force first made sense. The army vanishes when the world that needed it vanishes too. So before this journey ends, one question lingers in the quiet left behind. When we study the warrior's history lost, are we really searching for vanished armies? Or are we searching for the older versions of ourselves that once believed strength alone could hold time still? What do we owe the dead who were trained to become legends? When we look back at vanished armies, it is easy to be seduced by the surface of history. The polished armor, the disciplined ranks, the improbable victories, the names that seem to vibrate with power even now. We speak of elite forces as if they belong to a realm slightly above ordinary human life, as if courage, loyalty, and endurance become purer when sharpened by war. But if this journey has revealed anything, it is that no formation, no matter how feared, ever escape the limits of the people inside it. Behind every military myth was a human cost. A young man separated from home, a body trained past comfort into obedience, a friendship made sacred by the possibility of loss, a ruler trusting foreigners more than neighbors, a child shaped by a state before he could choose himself, a rider sleeping beneath an open sky, never sure where the next campaign would end. These armies were terrifying, not only because of what they could do, but because of what human beings are capable of becoming when history narrows their choices and enlarges their purpose. And yet it would be too simple to end in condemnation. These stories are not only warnings, they are records of ingenuity, adaptation, and belief. Across centuries and continents, people responded to danger with astonishing creativity. They learned how to move together, how to endure, how to trust, how to build meaning inside conditions most of us would struggle to imagine. Even in violent institutions, there were forms of devotion, identity, and longing that cannot be dismissed. History asks us to hold both truths at once. Perhaps that is why these forgotten forces still matter. Not because they prove that the past was grander than the present, and not because they offer a lost blueprint for power. They matter because they remind us that every civilization invents ways to defend itself, and in doing so reveals what it fears, what it values, and what it is willing to sacrifice. Armies do not rise out of nowhere. They are made from a culture's deepest assumptions about order, danger, memory, and belonging. So the final question is not whether these warriors disappeared. Of course they did. Everything human does. The real question is what remains after the myth has faded. Maybe it is this. History is never only a record of conquest. It is also a record of longing, of fragile lives asked to carry ideas larger than themselves. And if we listen carefully beyond the noise of battle, we may hear something quieter and more enduring than victory. We may hear the ancient human desire to matter before time moves on, and the equally ancient hope that someone, somewhere will remember us with compassion.